All right, welcome to this explainer on Dominica. Today, we're diving into how one island's totally extreme geography acted as a literal crucible. It's this incredible story of how a seriously rugged terrain directly shaped indigenous survival, dictated colonial struggles, and, as you'll see, is now forging a highly sustainable future. Let's get right into it.
4,700 feet. That's the height of Dominica's towering volcanic peaks. And, these mountains don't just sit quietly in the background. This rugged terrain, it is absolutely the main character in our story today, and it literally dictates everything that happens next.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to hit the nature island, indigenous resistance and survival, empires, slavery and emancipation, the struggle for independence, weathering the storms, and finally, a sustainable future. We'll be tracing that chronological arc right through to the modern day. Okay, Section 1, the nature island. Let's look at exactly why it earned that name. Dominica's geography is truly something else. Sitting right there on the boundary between the Caribbean and Atlantic tectonic plates, it's actually one of the youngest and, without a doubt, the most rugged islands in the Lesser Antilles. We're talking 751 square kilometers of incredibly dense rainforests, an active boiling lake, which, by the way, is totally unique in the Caribbean, hot springs, and over 100 rain-fed rivers. It's a landscape completely sculpted by active volcanism. And because this terrain dramatically rises straight up from the sea, there are barely any flat coastal plains or natural harbors. It was just incredibly difficult to access. This sheer lack of an easy entry point heavily delayed European colonization. It really set the stage for a kind of isolation that would define the island's entire history. Which brings us right to Section 2, indigenous resistance and survival. Let's see how that geographical isolation became a literal shield. The terrain here created a massive contrast with neighboring islands. While indigenous populations on flatter, more easily conquered islands were tragically wiped out or assimilated by colonial violence, Dominica's Kalinago warriors used those impenetrable mountains completely to their advantage. They actually held off Spanish, French, and British invasions for an astonishing 270 years after initial European contact. 270 years! And you can absolutely still see that legacy of survival today. While 85% of the modern population is of West African descent, and we'll get to that history in a second, genetic data proves that a uniquely high proportion of Kalinago and Amerindian heritage survives here, particularly over in the Eastern Territories. They remain a super distinct and vital part of Dominica's social fabric. Moving along to Section 3, empires, slavery, and emancipation, we need to examine that brutal, though significantly delayed, colonial era. So looking at the timeline, Columbus sighted Dominica way back in 1493, but it was basically left alone by Europeans until the Treaty of Paris in 1763 handed definitive control to the British. It was a really turbulent era, marked by intense conflicts. You had the 1793 general insurrection led by Joseph Caillou, which actually destroyed plantations and freed slaves, right up to the formal emancipation of over 11,000 enslaved people in 1834.
Now, here's the crucial point. While islands like Barbados were flattened for sugar very early on in the 17th century, Dominica's hostile terrain severely delayed that plantation economy. Sugar, or white gold as it was known, didn't really boom here until the late 1770s, but when it did, it brought the massive, tragic importation of enslaved African laborers. These were primarily people of Ashanti, Mandinka, and Yoruba origins who were forced to work this brutally unforgiving landscape.
Following emancipation in 1834, that rugged landscape proved totally unsuitable for large-scale sugar production without forced labor, so the economy essentially collapsed by the 1860s. And this led to a really fascinating diversification of the workforce. East Indian and Portuguese laborers from Madeira arrived to fill the gap, and the island was forced to shift away from sugar entirely, moving towards smaller-scale agriculture like cocoa and limes, clustered mainly on the coasts. All right, that brings us to Section 4, the struggle for independence. Let's track this complex push for self-rule into the 20th century. The two world wars profoundly impacted the Caribbean. For Dominica, the wars caused immense isolation, literally turning the island into what was described at the time as a waiting room marked by economic stagnation and mass emigration. But interestingly, this very isolation acted like a pressure cooker. It ended up forging a unified, absolutely undeniable demand for self-determination and social reform. A weakened British Empire simply couldn't ignore it anymore.
The turbulent path to independence, which they finally achieved in 1978, was guided by some massive personalities, none more so than Rosie Douglas. He was this dynamic leader and legendary orator who navigated severe poverty and really intense ideological hostilities to build a new nation. He even introduced the first universal healthcare scheme in the Caribbean, totally championing the masses during the severe economic austerity of the 1970s. Now, Section 5, Weathering the Storms. We have to cover the persistent, existential threat testing this newly won independence. Looking through this history of devastation, the real profound takeaway here is endurance. Dominica's position right on a tectonic boundary and squarely within the hurricane belt has forced its people to cultivate just an incredible level of resilience. From organized responses to the Soufriere volcano eruption way back in 1880, all the way to the massive, unthinkable devastation of Hurricane Maria in 2017, the people of Dominica have spent centuries recovering, rebuilding, and constantly adapting to extreme natural events. Finally, Section 6, A Sustainable Future. Let's see how Dominica is leveraging this volatile environment into something completely new. Rather than fighting the terrain, Dominica is executing a really comprehensive sustainability plan. Step 1 is protecting nearly all land in private hands, national parks, and wildlife refuges. Step 2 is going all in on developing green, geothermally derived alternative energy. Step 3 is building focused ecotourism resorts meant for researchers and educators. And all of this while fiercely integrating and preserving their cultural heritage, like Kalinago crafts and the Kreyòl language, in Step 4. Today, visitors simply do not go to Dominica for generic, all-inclusive white sand beaches. Instead, they go to hike the Waitukabuli National Trail, which is actually the longest in the Caribbean. They go to dive the Soufriere Scott's Head Marine Reserve, to explore the incredible UNESCO World Heritage Site at Morne Trois Pitons, and to witness year-round whale and dolphin watching. It's a total immersion into an ecosystem and a Kreyòl culture that has been intentionally and lovingly preserved. Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. We all know climate change is threatening the entire globe, with island nations right at the front lines of that risk. So, could Dominica's deeply rooted history, a history of utilizing its rugged, unforgiving nature not just for survival, but for real, sustainable prosperity, could that be the exact blueprint the rest of the Caribbean needs to follow? It's a powerful question to consider as we look toward the future.